Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we are going to be talking about the history of gospel music. A very interesting topic, especially in its placement within the US history timeline. As always, I've prepared a page of lecture notes for today, so let me go ahead and pull it up so we can orient ourselves to what we'll be talking about. So, specifically, we're going to be turning our attention and starting our story off, well, really before the 18th and 19th century. But in order to orient ourselves to this time and place in the United States, we're going to have to talk about slave culture in the North American colonies, which is our starting point for today. In our first section, we're going to be talking about the history of slavery in the United States. And I've got a few very interesting videos for us that I will unpack in the landscape and lens of music. But to kind of give us an idea of as to where we're headed, our 1860 is our first date of interest. And at this point, the great majority of slaves that were outside of, or that were inside of the United States were actually outside of the Christian church community. And there was a reason for this. So, and kind of to set our stage here, gospel music, and to get to our ultimate genre, is going to be something that's very much tied with Christianity and church music. So at the point of 1860, we don't have gospel music yet, but gospel music will start to emerge after this point. The reason it doesn't show up prior to 1860 is because there was a severe shortage of clergy and churches. And there was also a huge reluctance of slave owners to give free time to the slaves to become an active part of the church community. Of course, there was this ongoing belief that was perpetuated by the white community that Blacks were not equal, and certainly not in the eyes of God. And, you know, sorry, I can zoom in so everyone can read this. Whites ultimately feared that Christianity would not only make Blacks too proud, but ungovernable and rebellious. So there were a couple of things that were precluding the slave community at that time from being integrated into the prominent religious voice that was ongoing in the 1800s and mid 1800s more specifically. Speaking about that, I think it's important to remember how important and significant, rather, any place of worship is for perpetuating music. And that's true very historically. Thinking about music of the medieval era, a lot of what we have is only ours as historians because it was written down, for example, by monks, and there were only so many people who had the resources and ability to write music specifically. In a lot of instances, of course, you know, music is an oral tradition. It's passed down verbally generation to generation. And a long-standing establishment, such as a place of religious worship, whether it be, you know, a Christian church, a Presbyterian church, you know, whatever it might be, are bodies that help perpetuate the persistence and passing down of music. So even in, you know, I would I would say as time has passed, we have become more and more what we call secular, but that's not, I think religion plays a large part in many people's lives, not mine especially, but that doesn't so much matter. We're talking about like a historical survey, and it's significant to remember that in the 1800s, mid 1800s, even 1900s, you are still engaging with religion on a fairly frequent basis. And so for the slave community to be excluded from that, um, prior to 1860 is going to sort of make a little bit of a divide in terms of musical traditions not yet merging. Of course, that's going to majorly change when we do have the integration of the African American, which is slave community at that time, then integrated into religious practice and worship. So it very problematic time, obviously, for U.S. history in terms of, the owning of other people, which is highly immoral. But just to make sure that we know kind of why slavery persisted, I've pulled up two videos that are quite informative regarding setting the stage for the U.S. population and what's its makeup in the 18th and 19th century. So let me go ahead and pull up our first video.
Slavery, the treatment of human beings as property, deprived of personal rights, has occurred in many forms throughout the world. But one institution stands out for both its global scale and its lasting legacy. The Atlantic slave trade, occurring from the late 15th to the mid-19th century and spanning 3 continents, forcibly brought more than 10 million Africans to the Americas. The impact it would leave affected not only these slaves and their descendants, but the economies and histories of large parts of the world. There had been centuries of contact between Europe and Africa via the Mediterranean, but the Atlantic slave trade began in the late 1400s with Portuguese colonies in West Africa and Spanish settlement of the Americas shortly after. The crops grown in the new colonies, sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, were labor-intensive, and there were not enough settlers or indentured servants to cultivate all the new land. American natives were enslaved, but many died from new diseases, while others effectively resisted. And so, to meet the massive demand for labor, the Europeans looked to Africa. African slavery had existed for centuries in various forms. Some slaves were indentured servants, with a limited term and the chance to buy one's freedom. Others were more like European serfs. In some societies, slaves could be part of a master's family, own land, and even rise to positions of power. But when white captains came offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum for slaves, African kings and merchants had little reason to hesitate. They viewed the people they sold not as fellow Africans, but criminals, debtors, or prisoners of war from rival tribes. By selling them, kings enriched their own realms and strengthened them against neighboring enemies. African kingdoms prospered from the slave trade, but meeting the Europeans' massive demand created intense competition. Slavery replaced other criminal sentences, and capturing slaves became a motivation for war rather than its result. To defend themselves from slave raids, neighboring kingdoms needed European firearms, which they also bought with slaves. The slave trade had become an arms race, altering societies and economies across the continent. As for the slaves themselves, they faced unimaginable brutality. After being marched to slave forts on the coast, shaved to prevent lice, and branded, they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. About 20% of them would never see land again. Most captains of the day were tight packers, cramming as many men as possible below deck. While the lack of sanitation caused many to die of disease, and others were thrown overboard for being sick or as discipline, the captains ensured their profits by cutting off slaves' ears as proof of purchase. Some captives took matters into their own hands. Many inland Africans had never seen whites before and thought them to be cannibals, constantly taking people away and returning for more. Afraid of being eaten, or just to avoid further suffering, they committed suicide or starved themselves, believing that in death their souls would return home. Those who survived were completely dehumanized, treated as mere cargo. Women and children were kept above deck and abused by the crew, while the men were made to perform dances in order to keep them exercised and curb rebellion. What happened to those Africans who reached the New World, and how the legacy of slavery still affects their descendants today, is fairly well known. But what is not often discussed is the effect that the Atlantic slave trade had on Africa's future. Not only did the continent lose tens of millions of its able-bodied population, but because most of the slaves taken were men, the long-term demographic effect was even greater. When the slave trade was finally outlawed in the Americas and Europe, the African kingdoms whose economies it had come to dominate collapsed, leaving them open to conquest and colonization. And the increased competition and influx of European weapons fueled warfare and instability that continues to this day. The Atlantic slave trade also contributed to the development of racist ideology. Most African slavery had no deeper reason than legal punishment or intertribal warfare, but the Europeans who preached a universal religion and who had long ago outlawed enslaving fellow Christians needed justification for a practice so obviously at odds with their ideals of equality. So they claimed that Africans were biologically inferior and destined to be slaves, making great efforts to justify this theory. Thus, slavery in Europe and the Americas acquired a racial basis, making it impossible for slaves and their future descendants to attain equal status in society. In all of these ways, the Atlantic slave trade was an injustice on a massive scale.
So, yeah, the Atlantic slave trade was profound in its impact, not only in the makeup and direction of US history, but also in Africa. Um, so, as the video mentions, the principle of Blacks being unequal to whites in the eyes of God was something that was fought tooth and nail, and ultimately kept them out of the religious communities until the mid 1800s, and more prominently towards the later part of the 1800s. So why that's worth mentioning is because gospel music is very strongly tied to the traditions and practices that you hear in a Christian church. Lots of music that is, for the purpose of, or has a kind of spiritual nature to it, and often incorporates things that we see in hymns, for example, prominence of voices and vocal harmony. We'll get to the specifics of gospel and spirituals in a bit. In our second part, we're going to talk very specifically about things that predate this movement into gospel, things like the ring shout and work songs that were prominent within the slave community in the 1800s. But before we get to that, just one more clip dropping us a little bit more into the context of history, especially in the United States and in the original 13 colonies. There are, by the way, tons of videos, very, very good ones, and also very long ones on the history of slavery and the history of African Americans in the United States. A number of them are part of the listening links that I have included in the description of this video. So if you want more information on this past what I have time for in part 1, I really suggest that you look at those resources. But one more video.
When we talk about the wealth of the South, we're talking about wealth in enslaved human beings. In fact, those enslaved human beings in the pre-Civil War period range, depending on the year, between 15 and 20% of the total wealth in the U.S. That means that enslaved people are worth more than all the factories, all the stocks and bonds, and all the currency combined. In the 1850s, an enslaved young man about 18, 19, 20 years old in New Orleans goes for anywhere between $1,000 and $1,500. If we account for inflation, that $1,000 to $1,500 actually is equivalent to about $230,000 to $250,000. It's a ton of money.
And they are sold with no particular consideration to parentage.
You can't tell me to leave my family. I ain't going nowhere for you. You understand me?
There are very, very few cases where it disturbs the property relation. Men might acknowledge the biological tie, but they don't often recognize the kinship tie.
Thank you.
Your Chicken George has skill.
As one gentleman to another, I'd like to buy the boy from you.
Because slavery is so central to their economies, they become very invested in making sure that slavery persists. And so that's where you get things like the idea that slave status is heritable through the line of the mother. The slave societies of the Americas are the most brutal and oppressive because they went so far in the direction of making slavery an enclosed system.
Different states passed laws trying to limit the freedom of slave owners to free enslaved people. But much more often, there were stipulations that a person who was freed had to leave the state within 90 days, within 6 months. That reflects a fear that free Black people, simply by virtue of being free, are dangerous to a slave society. And if you have too many free Black people kind of functioning in your community, they advertise the possibility of freedom to the enslaved population.
Just finding the power within that system to survive took a tremendous amount of courage. And it really is a testament to the human spirit that African Americans were able to survive that system and ultimately to be able to do great things coming out of that system.
So one thing that we've already seen as a trend in music history is the idea that song is an important vehicle for not only community building, but also for navigating change and being rebellious. And there's a number of interesting musical traditions that start to funnel into gospel that have their roots in community building for the slave community through work songs and through ring shouts. And those early traditions have a profound impact on then the merge that happens with the Christian music landscape, and we come up with this very interesting music, which is gospel. So again, thinking about also, this video talked a lot about the idea of economy, and economy driving a lot of the decisions to continue to perpetuate the tradition of slavery. And religion really helped back that up. So we're not always going to, there's going to be some things that seem to contradict one another, perhaps in terms of gospel music, specifically in terms of musical traditions intersecting. Yeah, obviously the community was also a huge component of the population. So just by numbers alone are going to greatly impact how music is shaped very specifically in the South. So for part two, we're going to discuss these early traditions that start to merge and develop into gospel music. And that's going to be the ring shout, and we're going to start off with the ring shout and then move into other deviations, such as work songs. So I will see you in part two shortly.